different take on governance and consensus. When we're done, each of the speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. So that should leave us about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Everybody in the audience should see a little button for Q&A. And so feel free anytime during the call, you can type something into the, into the Q&A box. And when everybody's done speaking, we'll pick some questions and go through that for another 15 minutes. And then the call will end at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So with that, excited to start the call. And I'm going to turn over, Alex, you want to take over the screen? Alex Evans with Placeholder Ventures.
Sure, thanks, Lou.
Alex?
Let's give it a shot. I'm sharing now. Does everyone see my screen?
Yep, we see a beautiful mountain.
Fantastic. It's about to get better. Okay, all set? All right,
all set.
Great. So yeah, so thanks Lou for organizing. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to the discussion today. So my name's Alex Evans. I'm a researcher at Placeholder. We are a venture capital firm in New York that invests in decentralized information networks, primarily, and I should say ideally exclusively, through their native assets. So since I'm kicking things off today, my idea was to perhaps spend less time discussing particular innovations or trends in consensus or governance, and more time providing perhaps a more general framework for how I think about these topics. So I think after me, some of the other speakers will give more specifics on individual projects, and perhaps, hopefully more specialized commentary on things like governance. So in that context, the point that I mainly want to make in this first part of the call is, that at least in my mind, the discourse on consensus and governance is fundamentally motivated by different approaches to evaluating crypto networks. So I want to start broadly by situating what, at least in my model, those approaches are. And very, very broadly, they break down for me into three fundamental worldviews. One is sort of a technology first view, second is a money first view, and third is a governance first view. Some caveats on these before I continue. So mainly this is to show, how different groups and individuals with different priors coming into the space perhaps evaluate some of the different trade-offs that necessarily happen in things like consensus and governance. But this is not to say that these are perfectly fine distinctions. In fact, I think they're largely arbitrary and all somewhat caricatured for the purposes of the presentation. I'm not trying to suggest that someone can't believe some combination of all three or any subset of each. And of course, none of them are monolithic. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if there are perhaps even more disagreements within these categories than there really are across them. So with those important caveats in mind, let's move to perhaps, or at least in my little filter bubble, perhaps the most popular view on crypto, and that's what I'm calling here the tech thesis. Broadly, this views crypto as the next major platform shift in computing. The core capability that crypto enables under this worldview is the programming of trust on open, transparent platforms that can't be evil. The belief is that this will enable developers to build things previously impossible under the old computing paradigm. In that sense, this school of thought views crypto as analogous to the PC or the internet or the smartphone. The idea being that developer activity will continue to aggregate around the new open infrastructure, eventually converging on services that will attract millions of users and be incredibly valuable. And we'll figure out sort of business models once we get there. As with previous platform shifts in computing, things may start out slow and inefficient, but will inevitably and invariably scale over time without excessively compromising decentralization. This school of thought, I would say, is, for example, if we get to discussing more details on consensus, is more likely to view things like proof of work as obsolete and think that we can and must be willing to embrace experimentation in things like proof of stake and alternative consensus mechanisms, because computational scalability is a necessary prerequisite to the realization of the vision, right? So the second sort of school of thought here that I'm guessing most of the audience will be familiar with, is focused on money and views the opportunity here as a new global monetary regime. So the idea is, as U.S. global hegemony erodes, a digital trust minimized money could serve as a new, more sound basis for global monetary relations. So they view this as an opportunity to build something perhaps more analogous to the dollar or gold than perhaps a new internet or a smartphone. As such, things like security and trust minimization acquire primacy over technology. The best money wins, not necessarily the best tech. So in the tech case, the burden of proof is usually on the status quo to justify itself, if it's seen as especially if it's seen as holding back the future. Here, I would say it tends to be the reverse, though not universally, which is why I think a good chunk of this school is likely to be more resistant to much experimentation outside of things like proof of work, at least I think for the time being. So the final bullet point here is, scaling is great, but never at the expense of the base layer of security and trust. Take your scalability toys and perhaps go to another layer. I think if the caricatured like spirit animal asset of like the tech people is something like Definity, here I would say it's indisputably Bitcoin. And there will be ongoing debate there, and I think that's exciting, but I think that's still relatively uncontroversial to say at this point. Okay, so the final way of looking at crypto and the world is through the lens of governance. So from that perspective, the big idea here is a new way to organize human economic activity. So digital organizations of people have existed for some time, but they've either been very small, like a financial cryptography mailing list, or the relationships have largely been mediated by large corporations, like in the case of Facebook groups, or let's say projects on GitHub, and other such examples. They've generally required relative homogeneity or shared characteristics within the group to function, or at least to function well. So on the other hand, with networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum, we're starting to show that we can coordinate highly heterogeneous economic agents with massively different agents into the interests into these much larger networks. And we can do so without necessarily requiring a single entity to sit in the middle. So this would very much make crypto networks and institutional technology akin to things like governments, corporations, unions, cooperatives, and other ways that we found to allocate resources and act collectively. So if we perceive these networks in this way, the most successful of them will tend to be differentiated on the basis of governance. Another note here is like, unlike the money thesis, where you have criteria for what's good money or not, or tech where you can sort of compare, naively things like throughput on one chain versus another. Here, things, are perhaps a little bit murkier and more complicated. So what works for one organization doesn't necessarily work for another. So just as adopting, the United States Constitution isn't necessarily going to like fix Syria's governance, right? So like that's kind of what I'm getting at with this idea of governance isn't a feature here on the slide. So before I move on here, I want to come back sort of to the caveat to say, not all of these things are necessarily mutually exclusive. So for example, I think, that the tech and the money thesis can be rephrased perhaps as specific flavors of the governance view and possibly vice versa. So like looking at Bitcoin, for example, I think Bitcoin as money bulls tend to believe that Bitcoin has the best chance of any asset to preserve the integrity of its monetary supply. Of course, the only thing stopping the community from debasing the monetary supply and hyperinflating Bitcoin is the community itself. At least that's sort of the argument that a lot of folks in the Bitcoin community make around sort of P2P full node governance. So in that respect, Bitcoin is differentiating itself on the basis of governance. I think similarly, the emphasis on community as a core differentiator of Ethereum can be seen as a similar sort of governance-like argument, at least insofar as community is just on its own a dispersed set of individuals if you remove sort of structures of coordination and governance like consensus. So again, none of this is to say I necessarily agree with any of the above theses in their entirety, just to say that there are sort of multiple ways of looking at the same ideas and evaluating trade-offs in these networks. So here I'm just going to end with some examples of things that I find particularly interesting in governance. So again, starting with the point, the governance isn't the feature, and so not all of these will work for all networks. And in fact, a lot of the specifics here are still TBD, which I think is great. So one area that I'm really excited about is in sort of creating more clear and more formalized governance. So borrowing, I'm actually shamelessly stealing one of the arguments from Peter, ZeroX's governance researcher, that he made in a recent essay. The possibility of things like ex post opportunism are big perceived risks for participants in these networks. So, an example here would be when you make an asset-specific investment, like developing an ASIC for a specific chain, that literally has no second-base use case. So you become entirely beholden to the network to not sort of pull the rug out from under you. And that obviously happened when Monero and Saya literally pulled the rug under the respective ASIC markets. So that could be fine in some cases, but not when you're building something like 0x, where a wide variety of network participants are to take platform risk by building on your infrastructure in order for you to be successful. So clarity and constraints on collective behavior can be quite useful in situations like that. Similarly, I think engendering accountability and transparency among network actors is great. In addition to, as an example, decentralizing their treasury, Decred recently announced Politeia. That's a permanent public record of proposals, comments, things like stakeholder votes. So, just as in the real world, we have things like whitehouse.gov or senate.gov. Here we have systems, a system anchored on the Decred chain that creates accountability for users, admins, and other governance participants within the network. Finally, I have this idea here of what I'm calling kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah.
Alex, just real quick. Can you give an example of that? Just of the kind of accountability with regards to Decred that you've seen?
Yeah, the Politeia, is a very new piece of software, so we haven't necessarily seen it work in the wild, and so that's a very important caveat to make here. But the philosophy there is, let's say, you are engaged in a debate on GitHub about, let's say, like Decred recently, well, not that recently, or in 2017, voted to change their ticket price algorithm, and all sorts of different networks, network actors contributed on GitHub with their different ideas for how to change the ticket price algorithm to make it make ticket price less variable. And so creating accountability by time-stamping those individual arguments so that people can come back and see how people argued or how people voted or what people said, in much the same way that, for instance, we catalog the Kavanaugh hearings or any other proceedings in an official government body is something that engenders accountability and transparency. So that's the kind of thing that I'm discussing here. Does that answer your question, Lou?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Alex.
Great. So finally here on skin in the game regulation. So a great example, I think, of something like this is the fact that MKR holders vote on risk parameters in the DAI stablecoin system, which essentially has them acting as governors of that tiny financial system. But unlike a regulator that doesn't suffer monetarily if they make bad decisions, MKR holders get inflated if the system ever winds up under collateralized. So one way of thinking about outstanding MKR is as essentially an insurance pool of last resort in case outstanding CDPs in the system end up under collateralized, which I think is a really big idea in and of itself and very interesting from a governance perspective. Okay, so parting thought here is just to remember that governance is probably one of the hardest problems in the world, whether in crypto or not. Thankfully, there's a rich history in things like law and economics, political science, philosophy, the social sciences, et cetera, that we can learn from. That's why at Placeholder, we've had a dedicated governance researcher in Mario. Why 0x has Peter that I mentioned earlier. And, on this call, we're lucky to hear from folks like Stephanie. I think there's obviously a lot of new territory to explore, but we thankfully don't have to reinvent absolutely everything. That's pretty encouraging. So that's why I'm excited to continue to explore this world on this call and beyond. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, terrific. That was great, Alex. Really appreciate it. And now we'll hear from Ari Paul. Ari, you want to take over the screen?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Let's see. Hopefully everyone is looking at our presentation, Blocktower Current State of Crypto. Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to my fellow panelists and Lou for convening. Governance, as Alex said, it's a hard problem and a fascinating one. And when I was an undergraduate, 14 years ago, I majored in political science, and it's kind of fun being able to use little bits and pieces here. I'm wary of overextending analogies. I always try to analogize to crypto to things outside of crypto, things we're more familiar with, but there's a danger, which is that there are some things in crypto that are fundamentally new. So I'll be drawing some analogies, but I'll be careful not to take it too far. So how do we think about governance? Governance is a process by which a community organization makes decisions. As a very loose mental framework, I think it's useful to divide into kind of three categories. So on-chain governance, decision-making built into the protocol itself. As Alex noted, Decred is a good example of that with a formal on-chain governance system. I'll be using EOS as an example of that in this presentation. Formal off-chain governance, and here the formal really has to be in quotes, but that's where there's decision-making outside of the protocol in a way that is very clear and pre-specified and has kind of some level of rigor and consistency to it. So that could be authority vested by law, which could be, for example, a legal charter of a foundation or an operating agreement of a company. It could be direct control as in a protocol backdoor. So for example, Augur the developers had the ability to directly change the code up to some point, and then the plan is to completely give up that control. Or by strong consensus. So much of governing in traditional society and companies and even in the law really is soft. It comes from tradition, and it comes from very, very high conviction and strong consensus among the community that we're all going to do things certain ways. And that may sound weak, but ultimately everything comes down to that. Our confidence in property laws, the Constitution can be amended, or we could all decide to just abandon it. But if you have a strong enough consensus, as we do, for example, in the US, that we're not going to abandon the Constitution without going through an amendment process, that takes the form of pretty strong governance. And then lastly, basically anything else I would call kind of informal off-chain. So now we'll dive into some examples. So actually, first, a few thoughts on control. So I think one of the hardest things in cryptocurrency is wrapping your head around who controls a decentralized network. And there's a lot of debate and politics in the cryptocurrency space around whether, for example, miners control the network, or whether service providers like Coinbase control the network, or whether developers control it. And there is no right answer. There isn't an entity that controls Bitcoin or most other cryptocurrency networks. I think the best way of thinking about it is as a Keynesian beauty contest, where every stakeholder is really trying to bet on what every other stakeholder will do and influence those other stakeholders. So using Bitcoin as an example here, the miners have some elements of power, but ultimately they serve consumers. And the consumer here is the purchaser of the Bitcoin asset that the miners mine. If the miners mine an asset no one wants to buy, it's worthless. And so miners, their choice is heavily constrained by economic factors. Similarly, developers broadly write the code and implement the changes. But if the changes are not going to be accepted by miners, then they'd be implementing a change that would produce an insecure network because it wouldn't be secured by hash power or by validators. So developers are somewhat constrained by what will be mined by miners. And similarly, service providers like Coinbase, they want to provide a service their customers want. But their customers rely on Coinbase and other exchanges to find Bitcoin for them. So when you have a contentious fork, if you have two chains both claiming to be Bitcoin, service providers like Coinbase play a major role, because if Coinbase says that one chain is Bitcoin, many of their customers will blindly trust that. So in practice, what we see is emergent consensus, an emergent property whereby you have all of these different stakeholders trying to convince all the other stakeholders that their vision and their preference is inevitable and will win. Because no one wants to be on the minority chain. No one wants to develop a protocol no one's going to use. Miners don't want to mine a worthless token. So we get this kind of very circular reasoning about who controls Bitcoin that ultimately comes down primarily to economic factors of what people will buy. But again, that depends on, people want to buy what the best protocol developers in the world are working on. And they want to buy what is secured by the majority of hash power. So the result of this is a lot of public debate and a lot of gnashing of teeth in politics, which is sometimes viewed as unhealthy, but is just kind of a byproduct of this governance approach. So how does Bitcoin change if there is no formal, if there's nothing on chain and there's no formal governance process? Well, there is an informal governance process. Changes to Bitcoin are generally introduced by developers, either who associate themselves officially with core, which is kind of a loose community that develops the core clients, the canonical implementation of Bitcoin, although suggestions can come from outside of that group. There's then a public peer review process, and then the core developers will choose to incorporate it into the core client if they like it. Now, I can't choose what goes into the core client, but I can choose to use the core client or not. So there's a half dozen meaningful competing clients to interact with Bitcoin. So there is kind of a free market, and there is market competition here. If the core client introduces a change that the broad community doesn't like, what'll happen is a chain fork with the core client and its new consensus rules running on a minority chain, and that chain potentially would eventually die. So you have a little bit of a centralized development process, but ultimately you need the buy-in of miners, the buy-in of service providers, and the buy-in of individual Bitcoin owners and users. One line I really like is Bitcoin's governance has been described as governance by exit. And the idea there is that you can't really change Bitcoin. What you can do is fork it and produce a new coin. And so Bitcoin Cash is a good example of that, where some people wanted a different form of Bitcoin, and so they hard forked the protocol, and that resulted in a new chain. As an analogy there, there's a bit of a semantic debate over whether we should call that governance or not. So the analogy for that I like is when the United States was born as kind of a spin out of Britain, I wouldn't call that governance of Britain. It was more like an exit, right? So a bunch of citizens chose to entirely exit the British governance system and create their own. There is an interesting asterisk here that Bitcoin has some things that might be called on-chain governance, in that user-activated soft forks and miner-activated soft forks can make use of signaling within the protocol to then algorithmically implement a soft or hard fork, which is kind of a minor form of on-chain governance. I believe that every cryptocurrency, or at least all the big ones, have this capability, but most have not used it because most, frankly, haven't needed it, which gets us to our second case study. Ethereum, I think, is best described as using formal and informal off-chain governance. So Ethereum is very similar to Bitcoin in that there's a proposal process very similar called the Ethereum Improvement Proposal. And all that is, it's just a semi-formalized structure for a developer to introduce a suggested change, and a semi-formalized review process for that. The reason why Ethereum hasn't needed the kind of on-chain signaling that Bitcoin has is because you have a bit better coordinated development and coordinated control. Vitalik Buterin, co-founder of Ethereum and the Ethereum Foundation, they have no direct power. They don't control the Ethereum network in any way, but they do have a lot of kind of soft power. They're viewed as leaders in the community, and there's a fairly strong community consensus that Vitalik and his team, the Ethereum Foundation more broadly, lead Ethereum. And they help overcome these coordination problems that would otherwise might require on-chain signaling. One thing I think that's important to note with governance is the makeup of the community really, really matters. You can't intelligently, the same way you can't really intelligently analyze the United States as a country or as an actor on the world stage. If you're China or Russia trying to figure out what the US is going to do, you can't just read the Constitution. You have to look at the voters, right? You have to know, it's not enough to understand the voting mechanism and the protocol for voting. You have to actually know who votes and what their incentives are. So an interesting thing about Ethereum and broader about governance in general is that there may be an interesting self-reinforcing bias. So with Ethereum in July of 2016, there was a hard fork to revert a theft. There was a hack of a smart contract called the DAO, and the Ethereum community, the majority, wanted to revert that hack with a hard fork. Some people didn't like that, and they spun out, kind of the equivalent of Britain leaving, the United States leaving Britain, and they chose to create Ethereum Classic. And as a result, you had a more homogenous community left behind in Ethereum. So to the extent we see this in an ongoing way, where you have kind of continued forks, continued exits, and on-chain governance, we may see self-reinforcing local communities that become more homogenous over time. I think, kind of putting on my political science hat, or comparing this, an interesting distinction is it's hard to move from one country to another. As a US voter, it's not easy for me to say, you know what, I don't like the US system, I'm just going to move to Britain. That's a pretty high friction choice. Whereas in cryptocurrency today, it's very easy, right? Someone who owns Ethereum can simply sell it for Bitcoin or sell it for Ethereum Classic and air quotes, move from one to another. Service providers can pretty easily simply, service provider that's using Bitcoin in their ATMs can pretty easily add Ethereum. As network effects strengthen, that this may change, but at least for the foreseeable future, the next few years, we're likely to see a lot of movement from effectively voters who aren't happy that their vote that they're in the minority, whether that's formal voting or informal, simply voting with their feet and moving from one cryptocurrency to another. The last example that I'll talk about is EOS. EOS has formal on-chain voting where token holders, it's one vote for one token, and they get to elect block producers. And the block producers, they can do there's some voting that they can do on-chain, and a lot is off-chain, but in a formalized form. There's an EOS constitution and formal structures, including, for example, an arbitration body. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. As one would predict, we've seen some of the basic politics that is inevitable in anything like this. So we've seen evidence of cartels forming and vote buying by block producers, but we've also seen the potential upside of this kind of mechanism, which is these block producers are incentivized to invest to strengthen the ecosystem and increase token value, because that's how they can win more votes, or at least one way they can win more votes. One challenge, and this is something I think about a lot in the real world political side that applies for EOS and any on-chain voting, is it's hard to be educated. It's hard to have a good outcome if voters can't make intelligent decisions. And so with EOS, for example, a voter has to analyze more than 100 block producers and evaluate which ones deserve their vote. And that's a lot of work. So one challenge that any governance mechanism in crypto has is just being mindful that the more complexity, the harder it is to have an informed voter. And it's very hard to get good results from voting if voters almost can't be educated. So to kind of raise a few final thoughts on the pros and cons, all governance introduces incentives for corruption and rent-seeking behavior. If you give me a governance scheme, I can tell you almost with certainty some of the bad things that will happen. You know, it was very predictable that we would have cartels of block producers form, for example. That doesn't mean that the net result is negative. There's a big cost to not having governance, of course. If you don't have governance, it's hard to coordinate. It's hard to devote resources to the community intelligently. And it's hard to implement things that even maybe everyone wants a change, but it may be hard to coordinate and implement and to gain clarity that everyone wants that change. One way that I think we may see this play out is this kind of a federalism model. So as we've seen, you know, the argument for kind of the United States governance model was you don't necessarily want one size fits all governance for a country the size of the United States, or for example, a world government. Maybe what you want is certain minimal rules at a global level or at a kind of broader level. And then maybe you want smaller communities to have more aggressive governance that's more responsive to that community. So I think one thing what we're likely to see is this play out over the next few years, where we'll see some experiments at having base protocols like Bitcoin with very little governance, and then having protocols built on top or linking to it that have on-chain governance that serve a more specific use case. And to echo something that Alex said that I think is very important, there's probably no one right answer here. It probably very much depends on the use case. If you're trying to build a protocol for global money, you probably want a different governance solution than if you're trying to build a supply chain solution or a file sharing solution that's going to be inherently local. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, that was super interesting, Ari. Thank you very much. And now turn it over to Kyle Samani with Multicoin Capital. Kyle.
Hey Lou, thanks so much. Glad I can be on the show on the webinar today, along with Alex and Ari. Appreciate you guys having me. So for the content I want to go over today, Ari and Alex I think did a very good job of talking about thinking about governance kind of an abstract and some of the implications of it. And what I'd like to do then is talk about some actually practical kind of case studies of how we're seeing governance in action today for two blockchains that are really, today not intending to be global money, but blockchains that have other use cases. And so we'll touch on those with Factom first, and then with EOS second. So before we dive into Factom, it's good to provide a quick overview of what Factom does. So Factom today is basically a permissioned blockchain by design. The Factom system has, I think, 65 nodes in it. And those 65 nodes are quite literally elected by humans entirely off-chain. The purpose of the Factom blockchain is to log hashes of any arbitrary data. And then the Factom chain itself inherits all of its security, such that every 10 minutes, the Factom chain generates a Merkle root of its own blockchain. And they publish that Merkle root, and they store it on both the Bitcoin and the Ethereum blockchains. And so kind of the trust motto for Factom is trust Factom for 10 minutes and trust Bitcoin forever. And so the goal of this kind of approach is the Factom team realize there's real power in having the censorship resistance of Bitcoin, but that model doesn't scale. And so what Factom said is, look, let's decentralize trust such that we don't have a single server, and we can basically kind of run our own little blockchain on the side with 65 people, and every so often simply just dock into Bitcoin basically, and then you by definition inherit all of the security guarantees and consensus guarantees that Bitcoin provides. So it's a very clever way to get massive scalability. I mean, I think today Factom does on the order of hundreds of thousands of transactions per second of logging data for a very specific use case. It has a number of other benefits for around this use case, and you inherit all of the security benefits of Bitcoin. So it's a very clever system. It has a very specific purpose, a very specific design. And as a result, it also has a very specific governance model. And so I'll touch on kind of how governance works in Factom. The key thing to understand here in general is the system needs to elect 65 authority node operators, how those people work together, how those people work with Factom Inc. And so we'll kind of touch on that. So Factom governance today, as I've already kind of alluded to, is relatively centralized. And the plan has always been to start centralized and slowly decentralize over time. As Factom has kind of started to decentralize the system, Factom Inc. Selected 5 people who are formally called guides. And these people are were kind of there to ensure that the process of selecting the 65 node operators would be a coherent or orderly process. A number of those guys work at Factom Inc. or the Factom Foundation. A number of them are independent people. But these people kind of in aggregate really work to make sure that the 65 authority node operators were selected fairly through a public process. That process was entirely public. It happened over the last 6 months or so. Multicoin Capital does run one of the Factom authority nodes. We participated in this governance process and kind of followed the rules through it, so we can speak to this with a little bit of experience. And then the Factom guides actually meet once a week and discuss kind of what's going on through the system. The authority node operators in Factom are the people who literally run the network. They're split up between 2 categories. 33 of authority nodes and 32 audit nodes in the system. And these nodes are all, they rotate kind of roles and responsibilities programmatically, and they are compensated in doing so through inflation. The Factom protocol generates 73,000 new FCT each month and distributes those evenly to each of the 65 authority nodes. And so that is their justification for incurring the costs to run the system. It's also good to know that Factom Inc. is kind of a for-profit company. They built kind of the core protocol here. They also build software that they sell to businesses who use the Factom protocol to actually log data, record retention to the Factom blockchain. Today, the system is being used tens of millions of times per month. It's probably the most widely used application in crypto that no one really talks about. We won't dive into that today, but it's important to know that Factom Inc. Is still a steward of the network to a large degree. What's very cool about this whole system is, this blockchain has a very specific intended use case, and the target known customers are very well known and public, and so the whole system is, decentralized to the point such that no one party can screw with the system, and you kind of have Bitcoin as a backstop, but then these groups of people can now coordinate together to achieve some net new outcome. And so what's pretty amazing is the system is kind of growing and evolving, and the authority node operators, all generate income and are all working to improve the protocol and improve the service itself. For example, one of the teams building on top of the Factom blockchain has devised something that looks like the Omni protocol that was built on Bitcoin, and instead it's kind of designed for Factom, and this allows anyone to create arbitrary fungible or non-fungible assets that live on top of the Factom blockchain. This is now in the process of being discussed in the Factom community, and I expect it'll be rolled out in the reasonably near future. And this will allow anyone to issue arbitrary assets on the system. Whether or not that kind of comes to be used or not is still unclear. But what's very interesting about this is a group of people who have no affiliation with Factom Inc. have proposed a major kind of upgrade of usage of the protocol. The system inherits all of the inherent security guarantees of Bitcoin. All of these people are economically motivated to participate in the system. And all of these people are kind of working with customers for a very explicit design goal and consent. And so overall, it's been very interesting as a network participant to kind of see this system evolve and grow, again, with a very, very specific intended use case in mind. So next, I'll talk about EOS for a little bit. So EOS's governance is very different, and this is it's pretty clear because EOS is a very different intended use than Factom, where Factom is really designed for one very narrow use case, which is kind of proof of existence or logging hashes of records. EOS is intending to be, as the name, EOS stands for, I believe, Enterprise Operating System. And so it's really supposed to be a global distributed ledger that businesses around the world can rely on to build all kinds of interesting decentralized applications. EOS in its current form does not aim to be global state-free money in the same way that Bitcoin or Ethereum arguably aim to be global state-free money. EOS is a pretty different intended use case. And as a result, the system is designed both architecturally differently as well as in terms of governance. So first, we'll touch on kind of voting for block producers and as well as voting in kind of referenda in the system. So there's really two layers to voting in the US. You can vote for block producers, and optionally you can vote through a proxy, or you can vote through a referenda. So that would be basically direct democracy, things like voting on constitutional changes and those kinds of things. The US software allows all votes are cast on chain, and you can use that, like fundamentally everything is therefore arbitrary and configurable, including inflation, the constitution itself, the number of block producers, the number of votes people have. All variables are theoretically subject to change in the system, and all of those can be managed through direct referenda voting. Block producers in the system are the people who maintain the network. These people are compensated. Today, the network is inflating at 1% per year, which provides all the revenue that pays the block producers. EOS has a market cap today of somewhere on the order of $6 billion plus or minus. So 1% inflation would imply that block producers are generating in aggregate $60 million of revenue at current EOS rates. I believe 80 block producers right now are generating revenue. So that revenue is not split up evenly, but that means on average each block producer in the US ecosystem is generating, call it $750,000 of revenue, plus or minus. So there's real income here for these people. As a result, block producers are very strongly incentivized to compete for votes. And we see now a very active, basically political campaigning process among all block producers. US token holders who own tokens, it's they have the choice to go dig through and learn about block producers and make those votes in the system. And alternatively, they can kind of outsource this to proxies. I believe one of the block producers that Multicoin is affiliated with published actually a blog post yesterday about proxies and kind of how that proxy ecosystem is growing pretty quickly. Today, I think something like 100 million votes in the US system are kind of flowing through proxies, if I recall correctly. So, as Ari alluded to a few minutes ago, learning everything is hard, but people can choose to outsource their votes to proxies. Voting in referenda is kind of a whole different thing. This is more akin to basically changing the rules of the system itself. And again, all of this voting happens on chain. The cool thing we're seeing about voting in referenda is that you can, if we determine, if EOS token holders determine that block producers are acting malevolently, if the system is too centralized, not centralized enough, whatever the case may be, like the people involved can choose to update the system, and the system is specifically designed such that the parameters governing it can be tuned based on kind of social consensus. So one of the kind of nifty things here is that the EOS kind of community fully recognizes that a lot of things need to be changed and tweaked over time, and I fully expect we'll see a lot of contentious referenda in the EOS ecosystem over time. Whether governance by exit, as Ari alluded to, plays out is still to be TBD, but it'll be exciting to see how these referenda play out. The last thing I'd like to just point out about EOS, and again, Ari alluded to this, is especially in systems that are political, like inherently political, like EOS, people have strong motivation to signal publicly about their good intentions. I believe the #1 block producer is EOS Canada today, and EOS Canada is extremely well known in the community for building tools to help push the ecosystem forward. So EOS Canada has already published, for example, voting tools. They published some staking tools in the system and a number of others. A lot of the other block producers today have built strong brands and reputations in the community by building different kinds of software and tooling for example, continuous integration and delivery tools for developers, and all kinds of other things. We continue to see block producers find kind of new avenues of innovation and competition, and I expect that will continue to thrive. One of the really interesting outputs of this that is very non-intuitive is that you can make the argument pretty reasonably that among all of the major blockchains today, EOS has the most decentralized development process, in that today there are about 40 to 50 different independent entities that are actively building kind of core code and infrastructure for the EOS ecosystem. I'll define core here as developer tooling, like core mechanics to interact with the chain, so things like wallets and staking services, things to visualize votes and capital flows in the ecosystem. So things that I would consider very much base layer things, not even financial applications, just basic ways to interact with the chain. There are more than 30 organizations today and upwards of 50 who are independently building this. This is despite the fact that the EOS blockchain is 3 or 4 months old. Adjusted for kind of where it is in its life cycle, we're seeing this community, the rate of acceleration of people building kind of core infrastructure tooling is much faster than anything we've seen previously. And this is explicitly a result of the fact that the system generates, block producers are paid through inflation, and this, these are all, and that they're, inherently political. So these people need to earn the trust and goodwill of the community. And so we're seeing a very quick proliferation of people, taking that income out of these businesses and reinvesting it back in the ecosystem in a kind of inherently decentralized way. It's also inherently very capitalistic, right? Each of these organizations has its own strengths and weaknesses, and they're all choosing to kind of compete on their own unique lenses. And so there's not a single heavy hand at the top telling these people what to do or not to do. And so it's pretty interesting to see this play out. And again, I expect to see this accelerate as the ecosystem evolves. And so with that, I think my presentation's over. Happy to jump into any number of questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kyle. Those were both really good case studies, and particularly fact I didn't know a lot about, so really learned a lot there as well. Where the talks have been running a little long, so we might not have a lot of time for questions at the end. I'll ask all of the panelists to give text answers to any of the questions that we have that they want to answer. Afterwards, I'll be writing a blog post on it, so hopefully we'll get to a lot of the questions in that blog post if we run out of time, which I think we will on the call. And our last speaker is Stephanie Hurder with Prysm Group, who's I guess the only speaker on the call who's not a VC. But and obviously Stephanie, tell everybody about Prysm Group too, because I think it's really a terrific company.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lou. Let me present. Right, this should be pulling up momentarily. So my name is Stephanie Hurder. I am a founding economist at Prysm Group. Prysm Group is a group of PhD economists. We actually met in our PhD program at Harvard, and we advise blockchain companies on their economics and governance design. So we work with projects of all sizes on things related to token economics, market design, incentive design, and so forth. So today, apologies, can you guys see the screen?
I can't, Stephanie. It says it's loading.
Yeah, it says that it's loading. Ah, there we go.
There we go.
All right. Apologies. There we go. So this is I'm glad I get to finish off and build on some of the really great points that Alex and Ari have made in their talks. So I'm going to bring a little bit of the economics point of view to this. One of the things I'm hearing a lot of people say that is really great is that there is a lot that we can build on as we think about the future of blockchain governance, right? This isn't reinventing the wheel. There's economics, there's political science, there's even sociology, there's just a law, there's a wide variety of areas of knowledge that we can use to build governance models So just a brief point, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about governance, as everyone has, but governance and consensus tend to get lumped together. We really think of them as two different things. So consensus really, when we think of it as, the process of deciding whether and what order blocks are added. Sometimes the selection of block producer gets lumped in here, whereas governance is a much larger process. This is the process by which community members make decisions that weren't necessarily able to be specified in advance. And in our view, you really need distinct design for these two things. So you need, obviously, if you have a protocol, you need consensus mechanisms. As we've talked about and as people are learning, governance is an essential piece of a well-functioning blockchain platform. And these are distinct things that both require design, and the design needs to be aligned with the overall goals of the platform. So these are two pieces of the overall whole. And from an economics point of view, why do we need governance? We need governance because contracts are incomplete, right? It's impossible to specify ahead of time, whether we're writing a contract or programming something, everything that could possibly happen and what we would want to do in every single case, right? And so when we look at legal contracts, a lot of times there will be purposeful ambiguity in them, where we know that if certain things happen, we want to be able to go back and revisit and make new decisions based on the information that's been presented since we drafted the original agreement. And we need well-defined decision systems in place so that we can revisit and make decisions and platforms can adapt. So governance is exactly what this is. It's these well-defined decision systems that are in place after the platform launches. And one thing I think it was Alex said that I absolutely agree with is it's essential that these decision systems are specified in advance. An analogy we like to use is that it would be a terrible idea to try to design the rules for World Cup for advancing out of the group round if you were already playing, right? This year, I believe it was Japan who advanced out of the group stage on a yellow card tally. They had tied for everything else, and the final tiebreaker was the number of yellow cards. They had fewer number, so they advanced. That kind of rulemaking only works if it's been determined in advance. They never would have been able to come up with that if everybody were in the thick of it and already had particular outcomes that would benefit or not benefit them. And as we think about the evolution of where blockchain governance has been and where it's going, this is picking up on some of the pieces that Ari was rightly talking about. I like to think of blockchain governance as having sort of three phases. So in the original, and here we're talking mostly about permissionless or open blockchains. I'll talk a tiny bit about permissioned at the end. But the first phase, if we think about Bitcoin and Ethereum, there wasn't really formal defined governance. And decisions end up being made in an ad hoc manner by what I'm going to call influencers. All right.
Hey, Stephanie, we lost your screen.
We lost the slides. Are they back? There we go.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. In the original sort of first phase of governance, decisions are made on an ad hoc basis. And what I really liked about what Ari was talking about is, there's a difference between how Bitcoin governance has evolved, where we don't have the strong founder Vitalik versus Ethereum. But this is really, this is the kind of thing where when Bitcoin was having its block size debate, they called a couple of meetings in some hotel rooms in major cities and said, okay, everybody come and we're going to decide what to do. And it became clear as platforms developed that we were going to need governance. We're going to need formalized governance processes. So we moved on to what I would call phase two, which is off-the-shelf governance, which is that we know we need well-defined decision-making processes, and we look to non-blockchain systems for models of what we should do. And here we see, a lot of staked voting. For those of you who follow the Ethereum community closely, there's been a lot of discussion of something called quadratic voting. And these are systems that are defined and designed around non-blockchain settings. And we pull them in and we say, okay, let's put this in place and see what happens. And the third phase, which is where I think we're moving, is what I call bespoke governance, which is where we see that there are systems using off-the-shelf governance. They're having some successes, they're having some failures, and we start to say, let's take a first principles approach. Let's take the tools and the underlying, principles of economics and political science and start to build governance systems that are custom designed to their blockchain applications. So a great example of this at Prysm, we do, in addition to our client work, we do academic research. And so one of the research projects we engaged in this year is around governance in the presence of hard forks. So I know that Lou is a big fan of hard forks and has written about them a lot. And hard forks are really interesting because in most situations where governance has been studied, it's too costly for people to leave. If we think about elections, which were alluded to earlier, if we think about corporate governance, in most cases, whoever loses the election or the governance decision doesn't have the option to leave. Whereas in blockchain, hard forking is almost costless. And so, this is a really interesting development from an economics point of view that hasn't been studied before. One of the things that stood out to us is that, the hard forking is an interesting development, but most hard forks die, right? There are very few hard forks that actually persist. Between the time I originally wrote the paper and now, one of our 3 examples of sustained Bitcoin forks is rapidly heading towards the dust. And so, what we started thinking about here is, first of all, how do we think about when forks are good or bad? And, from a community point of view, when do we want forking and when do we want forking not to happen? And then secondly, how do we think about designing governance in the presence of hard forks? So ideally, we would want a governance system that encourages forks to happen when they're beneficial to the community and prevents most of the ones on the right-hand side of this slide from occurring. And so what we wrote, and I was happy to hear you refer to Kinsey and Beauty Contest, we wrote a paper that's called Blockchain Upgrade as a Coordination Game. And we were addressing these 2 questions using some of the tools of economics. And so we do a game theoretic study of a blockchain that's choosing a policy. And you can think of this as a block size, for example. The key piece here is that blockchains exhibit network effects. A great something I like to point out is that if we had infinite hard forks, we would end up in a situation where everybody was on their own personal blockchain. That's clearly not the optimum. So there's got to be some trade-off between hard forking and compromise, and how do we think about that? So we use the tools of an area called welfare economics to start to think about, how do we define social optimality? And we use a couple of different definitions to, allow some latitude. When are hard forks socially optimal for a blockchain community? And then how well do off-the-shelf voting mechanisms do in coordinating us on hard forks when they're good and preventing them when they're bad? And we look at 2 different voting policies. On the bottom of this slide, I've laid out the game we study. So it's basically users are on a chain, there's a vote, they implement the policy that wins the vote, and then the losing coalition can choose to fork. And we look at 2 different voting rules. These are both very familiar. One of them is good old majority voting, and the other one is this quadratic voting idea, which has become very prominent. And what we find, oops, how do I go back? There we go, is that hard forks can be socially optimal. There are some situations when they're great, but you can also have conditions where hard forks occur as what are called coordination failures. So you have a hard fork and then everybody wishes it didn't happen, even the people who left. And so this is when governance is really important, because in these situations where there are coordination failures, the chain would have stayed together if a different policy had been implemented. So how do we design governance to coordinate us on that policy so that everyone stays on a single chain and is happier than they would have been if there were a fork? We also find that neither of these off-the-shelf governance systems prevent these suboptimal hard forks in all cases. So, quadratic voting and majority rule voting are useful in different situations, but there's no magic bullet. And if you were looking at this particular problem, and you were designing governance to avoid some suboptimal hard forks, what you actually want to do is think about the policy proposal process. That's actually the lever you want to be designing so that you only get hard forks when they're good for the community. And so I think this reinforces a lot of the points that we make, and I'm really glad to hear other people bring up as well, is that we need to start thinking about bespoke, customized governance for specific blockchain applications, for specific blockchain settings. We can use tools of economics to do this. And we also need to think about governance as more than just voting, right? There's communication, there's education, there's the proposal process. And I think we're gonna end up seeing governance systems that look very different than what we see in other non-blockchain settings. And so just very briefly, I know we're almost out of time, you know, the optimal design for governance depends on a lot of different factors. It's context specific. You know, one thing I heard brought up was the population. You know, do we want only people with expertise to contribute, or should everyone contribute? What kind of information is required to make good decisions? Who do we want to have a voice in these different decisions? And I just want to point out, you know, as I mentioned, we've mostly talked about permissionless blockchains. Permission blockchains can also have governance problems. And we see this a lot in consortia that are trying to use blockchain for inter-firm transfers. And you get to the question of, you know, who owns the blockchain and how are we going to make decisions about how it's maintained when we might have competing incentives. All right, so I think I've used up my time. So I just want to say that, you know, Prysm, we are thinking about issues like this all the time, and please don't hesitate to reach out with any comments, questions, or anything like that.
Okay, Stephanie, thanks a lot. And we're down to our last 2 minutes. And so, as I said, I will be writing a blog post and asking all of the panelists to answer questions, any of the questions that they want to answer that were posed by, you know, and thanks Kevin, Eric, and others who put in great questions. And, you know, Ari and Stephanie, you guys both talked quite a bit about forking. You know, just real quick, I'd like to get Kyle's and Alex's view on, you know, if you have positive, negative thoughts on forking and this idea of, you know, which I think is very interesting. I've heard Ari say before as well, the whole kind of governance by exit concept that we have in forking. Alex, you want to comment first?
Sure, yeah, I don't think I want to make a normative good, bad sort of claim on forking in general. I largely agree with Stephanie that most of these things are context specific. You know, I agree that the sort of governance by exit through fork is in fact very, very difficult. You know, if we look across hard forks of major networks, most of them have pretty much gone into absolute disuse. And so that's really a very tricky way to exercise governance. I mean, the flip side of that is that they don't seem to have truly diluted aggregate network value across these chains. So we really haven't seen too many of what Stephanie described as these value destructive, non-Pareto optimal sort of governance breakdowns leading up to forks. But I think that's certainly a possibility. And I think in those situations, we should probably do our best to avoid them.
Okay, thanks. And Kyle, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think I'll generally echo what Alex said, in that I don't have a strong view on good or bad. I think it's far too early to say that in general, and I think every fork is very different. In general, I'd say I'm excited to see more forks, in that I see these all as massive social experiments. The motivations for forks are always fascinating, understanding the memes and challenge points that are driving people together, the strength of those ideas, understanding what creates the opportunities for a successful fork or not. I am expecting to see kind of hostile takeover forks at some point. I know it'll happen. So I'm fascinated by it, love learning about it. Don't see it as particularly good or bad. Very much TBD, you know, if they matter, or if there's just too much inertia for forks to be meaningful in the long run.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Kyle. And again, thanks, Ari, Alex, Stephanie, and Kyle for participating on the call today. I thought there was a lot of great stuff. And thanks everybody who dialed in, and you know, look forward to the next one. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Lou.
Bye.
Bye, Lou.